The day began with a shocking turn of events. The Nasdaq had not even opened when copper futures plummeted by 7%. Bond yields shot up dramatically, and the Swiss franc plummeted to a 6-week low. The global economic landscape was suddenly hit with a terrifying new reality as President Trump signed an executive order at 6:42 a.m., initiating an unprecedented set of tariffs. These tariffs, ranging from 10% to 50%, were applied to 69 countries. These weren't just threats or warnings, they were executed orders set to take effect on August 7th. What followed was the redefinition of global economic relations, particularly among the world's closest allies. The tariffs hit Canada particularly hard, imposing a 35% tariff on non-USMCA goods. But Canada was not alone. Countries like Switzerland faced a 39% tariff, Taiwan a 20% tariff, and even Cambodia saw a 19% tariff. The tariffs were applied not just to a few sectors, but broadly. This was a systemic move with a deep impact on global markets. For example, Swiss executives who were at a national holiday event when the news broke were stunned. 50% of Switzerland's exports to the US are pharmaceuticals, and suddenly their entire pricing structure collapsed. Switzerland, once a trusted ally, was now in the crosshairs of a trade war. In Ottawa, the reaction was one of disbelief, as Mark Carney, Canada's central banker, had personally met with President Trump just 2 weeks earlier to stabilize trade talks. Now Canada, the second largest buyer of US debt, was being punished more than even Beijing. And speaking of Beijing, the tariffs on China were set at 30%. China, which had a $295 billion trade surplus with the US last year, was now facing a 30% penalty, less than the tariffs imposed on traditional allies like Canada, Switzerland, and Brazil. That's the first contradiction of this new economic reality. The allies who financed the US deficit were being taxed harder than its largest strategic rival. While the tariffs were not entirely unexpected, they were certainly more brutal and wide-reaching than anyone had anticipated. Brazil, which has a minor surplus, was hit with a 50% tariff, while India, which has a larger trade surplus with the US, was slapped with a 25% tariff. The formula behind these tariffs made no sense, and Wall Street reacted accordingly. The market flinched, not because the tariffs were unexpected, but because the logic behind them was completely incoherent. On the stock market, certain industries took a hard hit. Tech stocks dropped by 2%, and industries like copper, steel, and aluminum saw dramatic losses. However, some sectors rose in response to the tariffs. Boeing and ExxonMobil both saw positive movement. The markets quickly realized that this wasn't a typical trade policy, it was weaponized purchasing. This was no longer about trade, it was about forcing countries into submission, essentially creating a ransom menu. James Greer, Trump's trade representative, confirmed this. He pointed out that some of these deals were fixed, while others depended on what the countries could offer. But the true devastation wasn't felt in Asia or Europe. It was in North America. Canada, for instance, sends 78% of its exports to the US, amounting to over $560 billion, roughly a quarter of its GDP. You can't just replace that trade flow in 4 months. Even if Canada retaliates, the US market is irreplaceable. The rationale behind these tariffs was clear. Target the countries that rely the most on US trade, because they're the ones who will feel the pain the most. Here's where the contradiction gets even deeper. Canada, which is being penalized with tariffs, continues to be the largest net buyer of US treasuries, effectively subsidizing the US deficit. But this isn't strategy, it's inversion. The logic of trade as collaboration is collapsing. Trump's plan seems clear. Run the economy hot, inflate exports, shrink imports by force, fill the deficit gap with tariffs, and fund the fiscal hole with foreign debt. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for more updates and content. We've got plenty more coming your way. But there's one major player who isn't buying into the game: China. Unlike the G7 countries, China hasn't retaliated yet. In fact, it hasn't even spoken. While President Trump and his trade representatives scramble to negotiate, China is sitting back and waiting. China doesn't need to retaliate. It's allowing its competitors to take the brunt of the punishment. Countries like Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore all face hefty tariffs, which will directly impact their economies. By imposing tariffs on China's competitors, the U.S. is creating a system where China benefits from the weakened competition without having to lift a finger. And this is where Trump's strategy falters. Despite the trade deal being framed as productive, the numbers tell a different story. The U.S.-China trade deficit last year was $295 billion, but the new deal is expected to reduce it by a mere $5 billion. That's a drop in the ocean, just a 1.7% reduction. Even worse, the reduction isn't coming from an increase in U.S. exports, but from a reduction in Chinese imports. China is simply selling less to the U.S., which means U.S. consumers will ultimately bear the cost. Meanwhile, the new tariffs are creating chaos in the global supply chains. The U.S. has now implemented a 40% penalty on goods transshipped through third countries. This means that if Chinese goods pass through Malaysia or Vietnam before reaching the U.S., they will still be subject to the tariffs. This has caused tremendous uncertainty in international trade, as U.S. importers are now freezing orders, unsure of whether their goods will be hit with retroactive taxes once they arrive in the U.S. And in the background, the BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is quietly making moves. At the Rio summit, they signed 4 separate currency swap agreements, including a deal between Brazil and China to settle 70% of their transactions in yuan. This is just the beginning of a shift away from the US dollar. BASF froze a $4 billion expansion in Texas and redirected its research and development efforts to Gujarat, India. Samsung moved its data infrastructure from Virginia to Singapore. This isn't just a geopolitical shift. It's a matter of self-preservation. Companies can't afford to wait for trade agreements to stabilize. They're already seeking new suppliers and new buyers. Trump's tariff policies are creating a global reordering. What began as a campaign to punish China has turned into a full-scale disruption of global trade. It's no longer about punishing rivals or rewarding allies. It's about relevance. And in this new world, the question isn't whether BRICS will replace the G7. It's how long the U.S. can pretend that the handover hasn't already begun. Trade has become a form of tribute, and once America's allies stop believing in the deal, it won't be the tariffs that hurt. It will be the silence that follows. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for more updates and content. We've got plenty more coming your way.